The story of John Henry Holliday does not begin with gunfire or dust. It begins with a gentle boy, born in a quiet Georgia town long before the Wild West called his name. It was August 14, 1851, in Griffin, Georgia. The summer air was thick with heat, and the fields glowed gold beneath the sun. That day, a boy entered the world who would later be known as Doc Holliday, one of the most feared and fascinating figures of the American West. But no one could have guessed that this small, fragile child would grow up to become a gunslinger, gambler, and legend. To his family, he was simply John Henry. John was born into a respectable Southern family. His father, Henry Burroughs Holliday, was a veteran of several wars, a man of discipline, courage, and order. His mother, Alice Jane Holliday, was gentle and kind. She taught John how to speak softly, behave politely, and treat everyone with respect. Their home was peaceful. The Hollidays were well off, and John grew up surrounded by books, church bells, and the sweet smell of magnolia trees. He was a bright, curious boy, small in size but sharp in mind. From the beginning, people said he had a doctor's hands, steady, careful, and precise. He spent hours reading, studying Latin, and learning about science and medicine. No one imagined that those same hands would one day hold a pistol instead of a dental tool. When John was 15, the world around him began to change. The Civil War had torn America apart, and even in Georgia, danger felt close. John saw soldiers march through towns, heard gunfire in the distance, and learned early what fear truly meant. But tragedy struck not from war, it came from sickness. His mother, Alice, grew weak. Her skin turned pale, her breath short. Day by day, she coughed blood into her handkerchief. John didn't know it then, but it was tuberculosis, the same disease that would one day come for him too. He sat by her bed as she faded away. She smiled at him and whispered, "Be kind, my son, even when the world is not kind to you." Those were her last words. John was just 15 when he lost his mother, the heart of his world. Her death broke something inside him that never quite healed. He turned quieter, more serious, as if life had stolen his laughter too soon. His father remarried quickly after, trying to keep the family strong. But John couldn't forgive that. He withdrew even further, hiding his emotions behind a calm, polite mask. The pain, though hidden, shaped him, preparing him for the lonely life ahead. Despite the grief, John's intelligence pushed him forward. He went to the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, where he studied hard and graduated near the top of his class in 1872. He was only 21 years old. Young, charming, and officially a doctor of dental surgery. People called him Doc Holliday, a title that sounded respectable then, but would later strike fear across the frontier. He returned south to start his dental practice. At first, everything seemed perfect. His tools were polished, his office tidy. Patients liked him. He was gentle, polite, and spoke with a calm drawl that put people at ease. But fate, it seems, was never done with John Henry Holliday. One hot afternoon, as he leaned over a patient, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He tried to brush it off. Just fatigue, he thought. But the next day, the coughing came, deep, raw, and painful. He saw blood on his handkerchief. He didn't need another doctor to tell him what it meant. He had watched the same illness take his mother. Now it was coming for him. Tuberculosis, the disease of death. In the 1800s, tuberculosis was a silent killer. There was no cure, no hope, only waiting. Most who caught it were dead within months. For John, it was a life sentence with no appeal. The doctors told him to find dry air, somewhere far from Georgia's humidity. They said maybe the western climate could slow the disease, so he packed up what little he had, his dental tools, a few clothes, and a heavy heart, and boarded a train heading west. He was only 22, sick, alone, and heading into a world he knew nothing about. The further he traveled, the more the land changed. Green fields turned into wide-open plains. The air grew drier, the sky bigger, and the people rougher. This was the American frontier, a place where law was thin and courage was currency. And though Doc came as a man of medicine, it was here that he would find a new kind of survival. In the saloons and smoky card rooms of Texas, his story would begin to twist. He would meet men who lived by the gun, women with secrets, and lawmen who needed someone not afraid to stand in the fire. But all that came later. Right now, He was just a dying man trying to stay alive. People who saw him back then said he still dressed like a gentleman, always clean, polite, and well-spoken. But behind that calm smile was a man running from death itself. Each cough reminded him that every day could be his last. Maybe that's why he started gambling. Maybe that's why he learned to shoot. Maybe he realized that if death was coming anyway, he might as well meet it standing tall. Doc Holliday was not born a killer. He was born a healer, but when life pushed him into the shadows, he didn't surrender. He adapted, and that decision would make him one of the most unforgettable men in the Wild West. The train carried Doc Holliday far from the soft hills of Georgia and into the harsh, open country of the American West. He was only 22, but his eyes already held the calm acceptance of a man who knew death was following him. Each cough reminded him of his mother and of how her life had ended. He knew his own time would come, maybe soon, but Doc wasn't ready to give up. If he was going to die, he wanted to live first, truly live. That thought guided him as the train rolled toward Dallas, Texas, the first stop in what would become a long, restless journey. When Doc arrived in Dallas, it was nothing like the quiet towns of the South. It was loud, dusty, and full of life. Cowboys shouted in the streets, saloons buzzed with laughter and music, and the smell of whiskey hung in the air. Dallas was growing fast, filled with people chasing money, luck, or a new start. Doc decided this was where he would try to rebuild his life. He rented a small room, hung a sign outside that read, "John H. Holliday, Dentist, Painless Extraction," and opened his office. At first, business went well. He had a steady hand, a soft voice, and the charm of a gentleman. Patients trusted him, especially the ladies who whispered about the polite young man with the silver tools and sad eyes. But tuberculosis doesn't care about manners or skill. Each day, Doc grew weaker. The coughing fits made it hard to work. Sometimes he had to stop mid-appointment, his hands shaking as he gasped for breath. Patients began to notice. They worried he might spread his illness, and soon fewer people came. By the end of the year, his savings were gone. He couldn't work long hours anymore, and he needed money to survive. That's when he discovered the game that would change his life: poker. Doc had always been smart, patient, and observant. The same skills that made him a good dentist now helped him at the card table. He could read people's eyes, their hands, their breathing. He knew when someone was bluffing and when they were ready to fold. He started playing small games in saloons, winning just enough to pay for food and rent. But soon the thrill of gambling became something more. The saloon became his new office. The cards, his new tools, and the poker table, his battlefield. It didn't take long for people in Dallas to notice the quiet young gambler who could outthink anyone. Some admired him, others hated him. And in those rough saloons, when pride was hurt, words often turned into violence. Doc's thin frame made him an easy target, but he was faster and braver than he looked. He began carrying a small revolver just in case. The first time someone pulled a gun on him, he didn't freeze. He fired back. No one knows for sure if that man lived or died, but from that night on, people gave Doc Holliday space. The polite dentist had learned how to survive in a land where survival belonged to the quickest and the coldest. As months passed, Doc left dentistry behind completely. He began drifting from town to town, following the games, the money, and the dry air that made it easier for him to breathe. He played poker in Fort Griffin, Dodge City, and Denver. Everywhere he went, stories about him spread. Stories of his skill, his temper, and his deadly calm in the face of danger. Some said he killed men for looking at him the wrong way. Others said he only fought when he had to. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Doc wasn't a murderer, but he wasn't afraid of violence either. He had nothing to lose, and that made him dangerous. In Fort Griffin, Texas, Doc's path crossed with a man who would change his life forever: Wyatt Earp. Earp was a lawman, known for his courage and his unshakable sense of justice. He was tall, quiet, and serious, the kind of man who brought order to chaos. When they first met, they couldn't have been more different. Wyatt was a man of the law. Doc was a gambler living outside it, but something about their personalities clicked. Wyatt admired Doc's intelligence and courage. Doc respected Wyatt's honor and strength. Before long, they became close friends, maybe even brothers in spirit. They would drink together, talk about life, and defend each other when trouble came. And in the rough world of the frontier, that kind of loyalty was rare and powerful. Still, Doc's health was always getting worse. The coughing fits grew violent, sometimes leaving him too weak to stand. He drank whiskey to ease the pain, not for pleasure, but to numb the sickness that burned in his chest. The more he drank, the rougher his temper became. He was polite when calm, but when pushed, he could turn into something fierce, unpredictable, and deadly. People began calling him the Deadly Dentist, a man who smiled like a gentleman and shot like a demon, yet behind that reputation was still a soul fighting a private war against illness, loneliness, and time. Doc had no family left, no home, and no future. All he had was the West, and the few people who dared to call him a friend. By the late 1870s, Doc and Wyatt Earp traveled across the frontier, from Dodge City to Tombstone, chasing opportunity and, sometimes, justice. Everywhere they went, trouble seemed to follow. But Doc didn't mind. He once told a friend, "I'm dying anyway, might as well die standing." It wasn't bravado. It was truth. He had long accepted that death was his shadow, and that acceptance made him fearless. In a world ruled by guns and greed, Doc Holliday had found his place, not as a doctor or a gambler, but as a survivor. He was no hero, and he wasn't pure evil either. He was simply a man doing whatever it took to live one more day. Soon, that friendship with Wyatt Earp would pull him into one of the most famous gunfights in American history, a moment that would make his name echo through time. But that's a story for another part. Because before the gunsmoke of Tombstone, before the OK Corral, there was still a man behind the legend, a Southern gentleman who had lost everything, except his courage. By the late 1870s, Doc Holliday was no longer just a wandering gambler. He was becoming a name whispered in every smoky saloon between Texas and Kansas, a man both admired and feared. The stories about him traveled faster than the trains that crossed the prairie. Some said he could shoot a playing card out of the air. Others claimed he had killed a dozen men. Most of it wasn't true, but Doc didn't bother to correct anyone. In the West, reputation was protection, and a dangerous reputation could save your life faster than a gun. He spent his nights in poker rooms filled with cigar smoke and tension. The clink of coins, the shuffle of cards, and the soft rustle of whiskey glasses became the rhythm of his world. He sat at the tables with calm confidence, his sharp blue eyes scanning every face. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were slow, measured, and laced with dry humor. He wasn't always sober. Few men were in those days. But even drunk, Doc was sharp. He could read people like open books. He noticed the twitch of a finger, the glance of an eye, the tightening of a jaw. He knew when someone was bluffing and when someone was about to draw a gun. That awareness kept him alive. But under that cool surface, Doc was still a man fighting a battle with himself. Tuberculosis was eating him from the inside. Some nights he would wake up coughing blood into his pillow, gasping for air, gripping his chest until the pain passed. He never complained, never sought pity. He just cleaned up, took a drink, and went back to the table. He knew death was always beside him, and maybe that's what made him fearless. When you live every day knowing it might be your last, you stop fearing the things that scare other men. That was Doc Holliday's secret. He didn't want to die, but he didn't run from it either. It was around this time that his friendship with Wyatt Earp grew stronger. Wyatt was everything Doc was not: steady, sober, and dependable. A man who believed in law and justice in a world that barely had either. They met in Texas, in the rough town of Fort Griffin, and something about their differences formed an unbreakable bond. Wyatt respected Doc's intelligence and courage. He once said that Doc was the coolest man under fire he had ever known. Doc, in turn, saw in Wyatt the kind of honor and purpose he himself had lost long ago. Together, they were unstoppable, the calm lawman and the reckless gambler. Two sides of the same coin. In 1878, Wyatt became a lawman in Dodge City, Kansas, one of the wildest towns in the West. When trouble came, he sent word to Doc. It didn't take long for Doc to ride into town. Coughing and pale, but smiling as always, Dodge City was alive with danger. Gunfighters, cowboys, and drifters filled the streets. The saloons never closed, and the law was as thin as paper. Wyatt needed someone who could stand his ground, and no one fit that role better than Doc Holliday. Doc didn't wear a badge, but everyone knew he was close to Wyatt. That was enough to keep many outlaws in check. When Wyatt walked into a saloon to break up a fight, Doc often followed. And if someone reached for a gun, they usually stopped when they saw the pale man with the cold stare and the hand resting lightly on his revolver. Despite his illness, Doc could still move fast, faster than most healthy men. He practiced drawing his pistol every day, the same way he once practiced dentistry, with care and precision. He didn't shoot for sport. He shot to survive, and he never missed when it mattered. Over time, stories of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday began to spread, two men cleaning up the lawless towns of the West. To some, they were heroes. To others, they were troublemakers with badges. But no matter who you asked, everyone agreed on one thing. If you crossed Wyatt, you'd have to deal with Doc. For a while, things went well. Doc earned respect as a gambler and a loyal friend. He was known to help Wyatt whenever the lawman needed it, and Wyatt, in return, always had Doc's back. It was a partnership built on trust, and that trust would soon be tested like never before. One night after a poker game in Dodge City, Doc was ambushed by a man who accused him of cheating. The man pulled a gun, but Doc was faster. He shot the attacker through the chest before the man could even aim. The law ruled it self-defense, but to the rough men of the frontier, it was just another reason to fear Doc Holliday. After that, he couldn't stay in one place too long. The air in Dodge City grew thick with tension, so Doc moved on again, following Wyatt wherever life took him next. And that path was leading straight to Tombstone, Arizona, the town that would make him a legend. When Doc arrived in Tombstone in 1880, it looked like a town of promise. Silver had been discovered in the nearby hills, and people were flooding in by the thousands. Saloons, gambling halls, and dance parlors lined the streets. Money flowed fast, and so did whiskey. But beneath the excitement was something darker. The town was divided between honest citizens and a gang of rustlers and thieves known as the Cowboys. At their head were men like Ike Clanton and Curly Bill Brocius, violent, unpredictable, and cruel. They ran the territory outside town, robbing stagecoaches and killing anyone who stood in their way. Wyatt Earp, along with his brothers Virgil and Morgan, had come to Tombstone to restore order. Doc joined them not because he believed in the law, but because he believed in Wyatt, and when you were Wyatt's friend, you didn't stand aside. You stood beside him. In Tombstone, Doc opened a small gambling table at the Oriental Saloon. He was charming when he wanted to be, but his temper could turn sharp in a second. People respected him, but they also feared him. The Cowboys hated him, especially Ike Clanton, who saw Doc as a threat and insulted him at every chance. The tension between Doc and the Clantons grew thicker with every passing day. And in that tension, history was being written. Because in the streets of Tombstone, beneath the desert sun, the cards of fate were being dealt, and Doc Holliday's hand would soon draw blood. When Doc Holliday arrived in Tombstone, Arizona, he didn't know that this dusty mining town would become the stage for his greatest battle, and his eternal legend. At first glance, Tombstone looked full of life. Silver mines had made it one of the fastest-growing towns in the West. The streets were crowded, the saloons were noisy, and money flowed like whiskey. But beneath the glitter of fortune, something dark was brewing. Tombstone was divided. On one side were honest miners, shopkeepers, and settlers trying to build a future. On the other were the Cowboys, a violent group of outlaws led by Ike Clanton, Curly Bill Brocius, and Johnny Ringo. They ruled the countryside with guns and fear. They robbed stagecoaches, stole cattle, and killed without hesitation. The local law had little power against them until the Earp brothers arrived. Virgil Earp, the oldest, became Tombstone's city marshal. Wyatt Earp worked as a lawman and a gambler. Morgan Earp, the youngest, joined them soon after. Together, they brought order where chaos had reigned. But even with the law on their side, they were outnumbered and surrounded by men who wanted them dead. That's when Doc Holliday stepped into the picture. He didn't come to Tombstone to be a hero or a lawman. He came because Wyatt was there, and loyalty was the only thing he truly believed in anymore. The West had taken everything from him, his health, his family, his peace. But it had given him one true friend, and for Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday would face anyone. Doc made his place in Tombstone at the Oriental Saloon, where he dealt cards, drank whiskey, and lived life one day at a time. He was sick, pale and thin, but there was a strange strength in him, a sharpness that made people cautious. He spoke softly but carried himself like a man who had nothing left to fear. And when he coughed blood into a handkerchief, he simply wiped it away and kept dealing the cards. To the townspeople, he was a mystery. To the cowboys, he was trouble. The tension between the Earps and the cowboys grew day by day. Robberies increased. Drunken fights turned deadly, and every time the law stepped in, someone from the cowboys swore revenge. Doc tried to stay out of it, at first. But Ike Clanton had a big mouth and he loved to use it. He called Doc a thief, a drunk, and worse. Doc, with his usual dry humor, would respond with a quiet insult that cut deeper than any bullet. The more Ike talked, the more the anger built. Everyone in town knew it was only a matter of time before words turned into gunfire. One night, Doc and Ike Clanton met face to face in a saloon. The air was thick with smoke and tension. Ike, drunk and red-faced, shouted across the table. He accused Doc of cheating, of siding with the Earps, of thinking he was better than everyone else. Doc didn't raise his voice. He just smiled that cold, crooked smile and said, "Why, Ike, I have no quarrel with you. But you seem to have one with yourself." The room went silent. Ike's hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw. He knew what everyone in Tombstone knew. If you drew on Doc Holliday, you probably wouldn't live to tell the tale. That night, Ike left the saloon burning with hate. He swore he would kill Doc and every Earp in Tombstone. The line had been drawn. Over the next few weeks, the cowboys gathered their strength. They rode into town in groups, armed and angry. They drank, shouted threats, and made sure everyone heard them. The Earps tried to keep peace, but there was no peace left to keep. Doc stayed close to Wyatt, never far from his gun. He had become more than a gambler now. He was part of the fight. He knew the cowboys wanted him dead, but he didn't back down. He once told Wyatt, "There's no living with a reputation unless you're ready to die for it." And Doc was ready. On October 25th, 1881, Tombstone was on edge. Rumors spread that the cowboys were gathering in town, armed and ready to take down the Earps. By morning, everyone knew trouble was coming. The cowboys were waiting near the OK Corral, and they weren't just talking this time. They were loaded for war. That same morning, Doc woke up pale and weak from another night of coughing. Wyatt told him to stay behind. Doc just smiled. He strapped on his pistol, adjusted his long coat, and said, "You may need me, Wyatt. Let's go see the cowboys." When Doc walked through the streets of Tombstone beside Wyatt, Virgil and Morgan Earp, the townspeople, stepped aside. They could feel what was coming. 4 men, calm, quiet, and determined, walking toward fate. At the other end of the street, Ike Clanton and his gang waited, guns drawn, horses snorting, eyes wild. The hot desert air was heavy with silence. No one spoke, no one moved. Until Virgil said, "Throw up your hands. I want your guns." What happened next would echo through history. In a space no longer than 30 seconds, the most famous gunfight in the American West exploded. Bullets tore through the air. Smoke filled the street. People ran for cover as thunder cracked from both sides. When the smoke cleared, 3 cowboys lay dead: Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, and Frank McClory. The Earps stood alive, and Doc Holliday, coughing blood and gunpowder, still had his pistol smoking in his hand. The gunfight at the OK Corral was over, but the story of Doc Holliday had just crossed into legend. He didn't fight for fame or fortune. He fought for loyalty, for Wyatt, for honor, and for the strange code he lived by, that a man's word mattered more than his life. As the dust settled over Tombstone, the town would never be the same. And neither would Doc Holliday. The sound of gunfire still echoed in the streets of Tombstone long after the last shot was fired. Smoke drifted through the air, mixing with the smell of dust and gunpowder. 3 cowboys were dead. The Earps and Doc Holliday stood alive, shaken but standing. For a few short moments it looked like justice had won. But in Tombstone, justice and revenge were often the same thing. And the battle was far from over. When the shooting stopped, the town exploded with noise. Some cheered the Earps for cleaning up the streets. Others shouted that they were murderers. The cowboys had friends, and those friends wanted blood. Doc Holliday, pale and coughing, leaned against a post outside the OK Corral. His hands trembled slightly as he reloaded his pistol. Wyatt looked at him and said softly, "You all right, Doc?" Doc gave a faint grin. "Not hardly," he said. "But I'm still here. It was a small victory, one bought with blood and smoke. But it would soon cost them everything." By nightfall, the whole town was talking. The Earps and Doc were heroes to some, killers to others. Newspapers printed wild stories about the gunfight, some true, some twisted. One headline called Doc the deadliest man in the West. Another called him a drunken murderer. The truth lay somewhere in between. He was neither saint nor sinner. He was simply a man who had survived. But the law didn't see it that way. The cowboys' allies in town filed murder charges against the Earps and Doc. Within days, they were arrested and put on trial for killing the Clantons and McLaurys. The courtroom was packed. Every eye was on the pale, thin gambler sitting beside Wyatt Earp. Doc coughed into his handkerchief, but his stare never wavered. He listened to the lawyers call him a cold-blooded killer, and he said nothing. When it was his turn to speak, Doc stood slowly and said, "I fought when I had to. I didn't ask for a fight, but I won't run from one either." His words were simple, but they cut deep. Even the judge paused for a moment before continuing. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came. Not guilty. The court ruled the gunfight was self-defense. Doc and the Earps walked free. But freedom in Tombstone was short-lived. The cowboys were furious. They had lost brothers, friends, and power. Now they wanted revenge. Ike Clanton, who had run from the gunfight, swore he would see every Earp dead, especially Wyatt and Doc. The air in Tombstone turned heavy with hate. Strangers appeared in the shadows. Gunmen waited at corners. No one slept easily anymore. Doc moved from saloon to saloon, his eyes always watching the door. He knew the cowboys would come for him sooner or later. Wyatt warned him to be careful, but Doc just smiled. "I've been dying for years," he said. "They'll have to wait their turn." Then, one cold night, the cowboys made their move. Morgan Earp, Wyatt's youngest brother, was playing pool in Hatch's saloon when a shot came from the dark. The bullet tore through his back. He collapsed without a sound. By the time Wyatt reached him, it was too late. Morgan died on the floor, whispering Wyatt's name. It was a moment that shattered everything inside Wyatt Earp, and it broke something in Doc, too. For the first time, Doc saw Wyatt's eyes filled not with justice, but with fury. The law had failed them. Now only revenge remained. The next morning, Wyatt gathered his brothers, his friends, and Doc. They saddled their horses in silence. The people of Tombstone watched as the small group rode out, a grim line of men with cold faces and loaded guns. They weren't lawmen anymore. They were avengers. This was the beginning of what history would call the Earp Vendetta Ride. For weeks, they hunted the cowboys one by one. Everywhere they went, someone whispered their names like a storm approaching. Those who had helped murder Morgan Earp met the same fate, fast and final. Doc Holliday rode beside Wyatt the whole way, coughing blood, pale as death, but fierce as ever. When others grew tired or frightened, Doc didn't waver. He once said, "Wyatt Earp is my friend. That means I'll stand with him to the end." And he meant it. During the ride, they found Curly Bill Brocious, one of the cowboys' leaders, hiding near a river. Gunfire erupted once again. Curly Bill fired first, his bullets whistling past the men. But Doc and Wyatt didn't flinch. Doc stepped forward, steadying his aim despite the coughing that shook his chest, and fired. Curly Bill fell into the dust, dead before he hit the ground. Wyatt looked at Doc and said quietly, "You're a sick man, Doc." Doc smiled weakly. "It's true," he said, "but I'm not dead yet." By the time the ride was over, the cowboys were broken. Many had fled, others were dead, and Tombstone was quiet again. But peace came at a price. The law wanted the Earps arrested for murder. Bounties were placed on their heads. So Wyatt and Doc left Arizona, heading north into Colorado. Two weary men carrying the weight of too many ghosts. They had won the war, but lost almost everything else. In Colorado, Doc's health worsened. His cough grew deeper, his body thinner. He could no longer drink without pain. But through it all, Wyatt stayed by his side, and Doc never once complained. He had lived longer than anyone expected. He had fought harder than anyone could believe. And though his body was failing, his spirit remained unbroken. The legend of Doc Holliday was no longer just about a gambler or a gunfighter. It was about a man who faced death every single day and refused to back down. A man who stayed loyal when everyone else gave up. And in the wild, lawless West, loyalty was rarer than gold. The West would never forget his name, and neither would Wyatt Earp. The desert sun faded behind the mountains as Doc Holliday rode slowly beside Wyatt Earp. Their horses kicked up small clouds of dust, the kind that hung in the air long after they passed. The war with the cowboys was over, but both men knew there would be no peace. The West had taken too much from them. Family, friends, and whatever part of their souls had once believed in mercy. Doc was coughing harder now. Each breath came like a small battle. The sickness he had carried for years was winning. He tried to hide it, but Wyatt saw the truth every time Doc pressed a blood-stained cloth to his lips. Still, Doc never complained. He had faced death too many times to fear it anymore. In a way, he had made peace with it long ago. They rode together to Colorado, far from the dust and gun smoke of Arizona. Wyatt hoped the mountain air might help Doc's lungs. Maybe it would give him more time. But deep down, both men knew it was only a matter of when, not if. In the town of Glenwood Springs, Colorado, the hot springs were said to have healing power. People came from across the country to bathe in the warm waters and breathe the thin, clean air. Wyatt helped Doc settle there, hoping it might ease his pain. Doc checked into a small sanitarium near the edge of town. The rooms were quiet, the beds clean, and the nurses kind. But there was no cure waiting for him, only comfort for the end that was coming. For the first time in years, Doc Holliday put away his guns. He had lived half his life with a pistol by his side, always ready for a fight. But now there was nothing left to fight. He was tired. Tired of running. Tired of coughing. Tired of watching death chase him day after day. He spent his mornings sitting by the window, looking out at the mountains. Sometimes the nurses would find him lost in thought, staring at the sunlight as it hit the snow-capped peaks. He didn't talk much anymore, but when someone asked if he missed the excitement of Tombstone, he smiled softly and said, "No one misses a storm once it's passed." Wyatt visited him whenever he could. He brought stories from the road, small bits of news, letters, and whiskey. The two men would sit together for hours, talking about the past. Sometimes they laughed like the old days. Other times they sat in silence, saying nothing at all. Wyatt once told him, "You should have lived longer. Doc, the West still needs men like you." Doc chuckled weakly and said, "Wyatt, the West never needed me. I was just passing through." They both knew this was their long goodbye. Two men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the smoke of battle, now separated by time, by fate, and by the thin line between life and death. As the weeks passed, Doc's body grew weaker. The illness had taken almost everything from him, his strength, his appetite, his voice, but not his wit. Even on his sickbed, he could still make the nurses laugh with a sharp joke or a clever remark. One nurse later said, "He was the most polite patient I ever had, and the bravest." Another said, "You could see the pain in his eyes, but he never let it own him." Every day, Doc faced his sickness the same way he had faced gunmen, with calm courage and a crooked smile. In the fall of 1887, the end finally came close. Doc could no longer get out of bed. He was thin as a shadow, his face pale, his voice a whisper. The nurses stayed by his side, trying to keep him comfortable. One morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, Doc opened his eyes and looked down at his bare feet sticking out from the blanket. He stared for a long moment, then let out a quiet laugh. When the nurse asked what was funny, he whispered, "This is funny." "I was certain I'd die with my boots on." They were his last words. A few minutes later, on November 8, 1887, Doc Holliday took his final breath. No gunfire, no shouting, no chaos. Just silence. The silence of a man who had outrun death for 36 years, only to finally meet it in peace. Wyatt Earp wasn't there when Doc died. He got the news days later, and those who saw him said he didn't speak for a long time. He simply nodded and walked away. He would later say, Doc Holliday was the most loyal friend a man could have. They buried Doc in Linwood Cemetery, on a hill overlooking the town. No grand funeral, no crowd of mourners. Just a few quiet words and the whisper of the mountain wind. The marker above his grave simply read, John Henry Holliday, 1851-1887. Years later, stories about Doc grew larger than life. People called him an outlaw, a hero, a killer, and a savior. Some painted him as a villain. others as a man who lived by honor in a dishonorable time. But those who truly knew him, Wyatt most of all, said the truth was simple. Doc Holliday was a man who faced death every day and still managed to laugh. He was loyal to his friends, dangerous to his enemies, and fearless until the very end. In the end, the sick young dentist from Georgia had become a legend of the American frontier. He left behind no fortune, no family, and no home. Only a name, whispered around campfires, written in dime novels, and remembered in history. He lived fast, he died young, and he never lost his soul to fear. That was the true legacy of Doc Holliday, the man who looked death in the eye and smiled. When Doc Holliday died in 1887, his story should have ended there, buried quietly in the hills of Colorado. But legends don't die that easily. Sometimes the truth becomes bigger than the man who lived it. Sometimes the world needs heroes and villains so badly, it creates them out of anyone brave enough to stand in the fire. That's what happened to John Henry Doc Holliday. The frail dentist from Georgia, the gambler, the gunfighter, the loyal friend, he became more than a man. He became a myth. In the years after his death, stories about Doc began to spread across the frontier like wildfire. Old cowboys told tales around campfires about the deadly gambler who never missed his mark. Traveling writers added their own flair, turning small moments into epic battles and quiet words into famous quotes. Everywhere people gathered, saloons, train stations, barbershops, someone always had a Doc Holliday story. Some said he could shoot the wings off a fly at 20 paces. Others swore he once faced down 6 men at once and walked away untouched. Most of those stories weren't true, but no one cared. The truth didn't matter anymore. The legend did. Doc had lived most of his life in the shadows of stronger, healthier men. He wasn't big and he wasn't loud. He didn't rule towns like Wyatt Earp or ride with an army of outlaws like Jesse James. But he had something few others did, a tragic charm. He was a man dying from the inside, yet still fearless on the outside. A man who smiled at death, played cards with fate, and faced every bullet as if it didn't matter. That contradiction, between fragility and ferocity, made him unforgettable. People loved to imagine him sitting at a poker table, coughing into a handkerchief with one hand while holding a revolver steady with the other. He was both gentle and deadly, polite and dangerous, calm and reckless. And that made him fascinating. By the early 1900s, newspapers and dime novels had turned Doc Holliday into a household name. Writers described him as everything from a heroic lawman to a cold-blooded killer. Each story twisted the truth a little more. Some said he shot 50 men. Others said he saved the West. The real Doc Holliday, the man of pain, humor, and loyalty, was slowly being buried beneath layers of legend. Wyatt Earp, who outlived Doc by decades, helped shape that legend himself. In his later years, Wyatt told his version of the Tombstone story to writers and reporters. And in every version, Doc was there, brave, loyal, and unshakable. Wyatt never forgot his friend, and his words kept Doc alive in memory. When Hollywood arrived in the 20th century, it found in Doc Holliday the perfect Western character. A sick man who could outshoot anyone, a gambler with manners and a death wish, a friend who would kill, or die, for loyalty. The first films about the Corral appeared in the 1930s and 1940s. In each, Doc became a little more romantic, a little more dramatic. Actors like Cesar Romero, Victor Mature, and later Kirk Douglas played him as the charming outlaw, half angel, half devil. But it was Val Kilmer, decades later, in the movie Tombstone, 1993, who brought Doc Holliday roaring back to life for a new generation. In that film, Kilmer's Doc was smooth-talking, fearless, and deeply human. He made people laugh, then broke their hearts. Every cough, every grin, every line, especially "I'm your Huckleberry," captured the spirit of the man behind the myth. It wasn't just acting. It was resurrection. That version of Doc Holliday became iconic. Young audiences who had never heard his name suddenly admired him, not for his gun, but for his courage. He became a symbol of loyalty, of living boldly even when death is certain. And that's something people could still feel, even 100 years after he was gone. But behind the movie lights and the myth, the real story of Doc Holliday was far more human. He wasn't born for violence. He didn't seek fame or glory. He was just a man trying to outlive his pain, and somehow, in doing so, became timeless. Historians later uncovered letters, court documents, and witness accounts that painted a clearer picture of who he really was. They found a man who was fiercely loyal, often misunderstood, and far more intelligent than most around him. He read books, quoted poetry, and even carried medical instruments long after he stopped being a dentist. He never forgot where he came from or who he once was. In those letters, you can still see traces of the polite Southern boy his mother raised, the one who once believed in healing before the world taught him how to kill. Today, Doc Holliday's name still stands as one of the great symbols of the Wild West. Towns across the country honor him with festivals, museums, and historical markers. His grave in Glenwood Springs draws visitors from around the world. Some come to see the legend. Others come to feel the quiet truth of a man who lived and died on his own terms. There's even debate about whether his body lies in that grave at all. Some say the ground was too hard that winter and he was buried in an unmarked spot nearby. But maybe that mystery is fitting. Doc always did prefer to keep people guessing. If Doc Holliday were alive today, he might laugh at all the stories told about him. He'd probably say something clever, take a sip of whiskey, and tell the truth in one simple line. Maybe something like, "I wasn't as good as they say, but I was better than I had to be." That's the kind of man he was. Flawed, funny, fearless. The kind of man who didn't need to live forever, because his story already would. In the end, the legend of Doc Holliday lives not in his gunfights or his gambling, but in his spirit. He faced life's hardest truth, that time runs out for everyone, and instead of hiding from it, he met it head-on. And maybe that's why, more than a century later, people still remember his name. Because Doc Holliday wasn't just a man of the West. He was a man who showed the world how to live while dying. Long after the guns of Tombstone fell silent, one question still lingered in the wind. What made Doc Holliday who he was? He wasn't born a killer. He wasn't a man chasing fame or fortune. He wasn't even truly part of the law nor the lawless. He stood somewhere in between. A man who lived by his own rules in a world that didn't have many, and those rules, his personal code, would come to define him as much as any gunfight ever did. People called it the Code of the West, though it wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't about laws or courts or sheriffs. It was about how a man carried himself, about loyalty, courage, respect, and honor. For Doc Holliday, that code was simple. A man keeps his word, stands by his friends, and faces what comes without fear. He lived by it every day, even when it cost him everything. Especially then. From the moment he left Georgia, Doc lived on borrowed time. Tuberculosis was his shadow, always following, always close. He could have given up, but instead he turned that shadow into strength. Where others saw death, he saw freedom, and that freedom made him fearless. When you have nothing left to lose, you stop pretending. You stop lying to yourself about what matters. For Doc, only two things mattered: loyalty and courage. His friendship with Wyatt Earp was proof of that. Most men back then were loyal only until the bullets started flying. But not Doc. He stood beside Wyatt when the law turned its back on him, when the town turned against him, and when the cowboys came for blood. He didn't fight for a badge or for money. He fought because of loyalty, the rare kind that doesn't fade when the world burns. When people later asked Wyatt why he trusted Doc so much, he said, "Because I knew he'd never leave me in a fight." And he never did. That was Doc's honor. It wasn't about doing what was legal. It was about doing what was right in his own eyes. But loyalty wasn't the only piece of his code. The second part was courage, not the kind that comes from muscle or might, but the quiet kind that comes from living with fear and still moving forward anyway. Every day, Doc Holliday woke up knowing he was dying. Every breath hurt. Every cough reminded him that his time was running out. Yet he never let that break him. He played cards, laughed with friends, and faced gunmen who were healthier and stronger. And he never flinched. That kind of courage doesn't come from pride. It comes from acceptance. Doc once said, "I suppose it's the fear of death that makes cowards of us all." He had lost that fear, and without it, he was unstoppable. The third part of his code was respect, a strange word for a man so often surrounded by violence, but one he believed in deeply. Doc respected people who lived honestly, no matter what side of the law they were on. He treated women with kindness, dealt cards fairly, and never drew his gun unless he had no choice. He never killed for pleasure. He never bragged about his fights, and he never turned his back on a man who needed help. Even those who hated him admitted one thing: Doc Holliday was fair. Cold maybe, but fair. Some say the West was ruled by guns, but Doc knew it was ruled by reputation. A man's word was worth more than gold. If you broke it, you were finished. So Doc made sure his word meant something. He once told a gambler who tried to cheat him, "You can steal my money, sir, but you'll never steal my name." And that was the truth of him. His name was his honor, and he guarded it like his last breath. But honor has a price. And for Doc, that price was peace. He could never settle down, never rest, never find the calm he might have deserved. Even when the fighting ended, his own body kept waging war against him. Yet he never cursed his fate. He took it all, the pain, the loss, the loneliness, with a strange grace. He used to joke about his sickness, saying, "Dying's no way to make a living, but I'm good at both." That was Doc's way: humor in the face of heartbreak, laughter at the edge of death. When you look at Doc Holliday's life, you see more than a gunslinger's story. You see a lesson, a message hidden beneath the smoke and the legend. It's a reminder that how you live matters far more than how long you live, that loyalty and courage can outlive even the body, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is face his own ending without running from it. Doc Holliday never lived to grow old. But maybe that was the point. He lived exactly the way he wanted: fast, honest, and unafraid. And though he left this world coughing blood and smiling, he left behind something stronger than life, a name that stood for loyalty, courage, and honor. Today, when people remember Doc Holliday, they remember the man with the gun, the gambler with the quick draw. But those who look closer see something deeper: the dying man who refused to die afraid. The friend who stood by his word. The Southern gentleman who never stopped being polite, even in the face of violence. He didn't write his story with ink. He wrote it with actions. Every fight, every laugh, every breath that defied the sickness inside him. That's why his legend lives. Because courage doesn't fade, and loyalty never dies. The Wild West was full of men who carried guns, men who rode horses across endless deserts, chased fame, fought for justice, or ran from the law. But among them all, only a few became legends, and even fewer became symbols. Doc Holliday was one of them. Not because he was the fastest or the fiercest, but because he was something rarer, real. He was human in a world that often forgot what humanity looked like. Before Doc Holliday, heroes in Western stories were clean-cut men, brave sheriffs, strong cowboys, perfect gentlemen. They always wore white hats and fought only for justice. But Doc didn't fit that mold. He was sick, flawed, and often drunk. He lived by gambling instead of the law. And yet somehow he became one of the most beloved figures in frontier history. Why? Because people saw themselves in him. He wasn't untouchable or perfect. He was brave because he was weak. He was loyal because he had lost everything else. And he kept going, long after pain and sickness tried to stop him. That made him more than a myth. It made him human. Doc Holliday's story changed how America saw the idea of the Western hero. He wasn't born into greatness. He didn't wear a badge or own a ranch. He wasn't even a soldier or outlaw by choice. He was a dying man who turned his last years into a story that would live forever. He showed that heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they cough blood. Sometimes they lose their temper. Sometimes they gamble with life itself. But what defines them isn't how they die. It's how they live before they do. In a world that worshipped strength, Doc showed the power of weakness. He reminded people that courage isn't about muscle or might. It's about facing fear when you have every reason to run away. Every time Doc walked into a saloon knowing half the room wanted him dead, that was courage. Every time he stood beside Wyatt Earp when the whole town turned against them, that was loyalty. And every time he laughed through the pain of his sickness, that was strength. He became the spirit of a West that was dying, the last breath of a world where men lived fast, died young, and left behind stories bigger than their lives. Over the years, writers and filmmakers built the myth of the West around men like Doc. But what made him stand out was that mix of darkness and light: the gentleman with a pistol, the doctor-turned-gambler, the sinner with a code. He blurred the line between good and bad, between right and wrong, and made people question what those words really meant. Was he a hero for standing with Wyatt Earp, Or a killer for drawing his gun? Was he brave for facing death head-on, or reckless for welcoming it? Maybe he was all of those things, and that's what made him unforgettable. Even now, when people think of the Old West, they think of Doc Holliday. Not just because of the gunfights, but because of the attitude, that quiet confidence, that dry humor, that sense of honor that didn't need words. He represented something uniquely American, the idea that even in chaos, a man could still choose his own path. That even when life is cruel, you can still meet it with dignity. He wasn't a saint, but he had style, and in the rough, raw West, style mattered. The West itself was changing as Doc's legend grew. The wide-open land was closing. Railroads and towns were replacing the wilderness. Law was replacing chaos. The world Doc had lived in was fading away, and people missed it, even the danger, even the dirt. Doc became the symbol of that loss, a reminder of freedom, of defiance, of men who didn't live by anyone's rules but their own. He was the ghost of the Wild West, coughing, laughing, and never bowing to fate. Historians still debate the details of his life, how many men he killed, how sick he really was, whether he ever regretted anything. But one thing everyone agrees on, Doc Holliday lived honestly. Not lawfully, not perfectly, but honestly. He didn't pretend to be more than he was. And that, in a world full of masks, is what made him a legend. He was loyal to one friend. He was true to one code. And he faced one truth, death, with more grace than most men face life. Even now, you can find his spirit in every Western hero who came after. When a gunslinger tips his hat before a duel, that's Doc. When a man stands up for his friend, no matter the odds, that's Doc. When a hero knows he's doomed but rides out anyway, that's Doc Holliday's ghost. Smiling in the background, he taught the world that courage isn't about living forever. It's about how you live before you go, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't want to be heroes at all. More than a century later, the spirit of the West still carries his name. In every story about loyalty, in every movie about friendship, in every heart that beats a little faster at the sound of spurs in the dust, Doc Holliday lives on. He was the man who turned dying into an art, loyalty into law, and friendship into legend. And that spirit, his spirit, still rides the wind across the desert he once called home. Time has a way of turning men into memories, and memories into legends. But every now and then, a legend keeps breathing, not through fame, but through the truth it leaves behind. Doc Holliday is one of those few. Over 100 years have passed since the day he closed his eyes in that quiet Colorado room. The West he once knew is long gone. The dust settled, the guns silent, the cowboys just names in history books. But Doc's story, somehow it still feels alive. It still speaks to us, even in a world far different from the one he rode through. Why? Because Doc Holliday's story isn't just about the Wild West. It's about life, loyalty, courage, and the way one man faced death without losing himself. Doc Holliday didn't have an easy life. He was born with privilege but cursed with sickness. He had education, skill, and a future, all taken by fate before he turned 25. He could have given up. He could have hidden away, waiting quietly for the end. But he didn't. He went west, chasing air, adventure, and maybe one last chance to feel alive. And that decision, that refusal to surrender, is what made him unforgettable. He didn't let his illness define him. He didn't let fear rule him. He took what little time he had and filled it with everything that makes a life worth living. Friendship, laughter, love, and danger. If there's one lesson Doc Holliday left behind, it's this: we don't get to choose how long we live, but we do get to choose how well we live. He was dying, yet he lived more in 36 years than most people do in 80. He laughed louder, fought harder, and stood taller than men twice his size. He didn't waste time pretending to be perfect. He simply chose to be real. In a world obsessed with control, Doc's story reminds us of the one truth we all try to ignore. Life is fragile. Every breath is borrowed time, and when you finally accept that, fear loses its power. Doc also taught us something rare, the meaning of loyalty. When most men run from danger, he ran toward it for a friend. When Wyatt Earp needed him, Doc never hesitated. He didn't ask for reward or recognition. He stood beside his friend because it was the right thing to do. That kind of loyalty doesn't come from duty. It comes from heart, from the quiet belief that a man's word matters, even when the world doesn't. And that belief, that kind of friendship, is something our world still needs. In our time, loyalty has become easy to promise and hard to prove. But Doc Holliday proved it every time he drew his gun, not for himself, but for someone he cared about. That's what makes his story timeless. It isn't the gunfights, it's the love beneath them. He also showed the power of acceptance. Doc knew he couldn't win against death. But instead of letting that destroy him, he made peace with it. He found freedom in his fate, and that gave him something stronger than fear. It gave him peace. That's a lesson most of us still struggle to learn. We spend our lives running from the things we can't control. Sickness, loss, time. But Doc faced all of it head on. And in doing so, he found a strange kind of peace that few ever find. He once said, "There's no normal life. There's just life. Get on with it." That line has echoed through history because it's the truth we all need to hear. There's no perfect moment. There's no safe path. There's only now, and what you choose to do with it. And then there's courage. Not the kind that comes from guns or violence, but the quiet courage to keep going when everything hurts. To keep smiling when the world feels unfair. To keep fighting when the end is already written. That was Doc Holliday, a man who fought not for victory, but for dignity. A man who knew death was waiting, but met it with a grin. A man who refused to be pitied, refused to quit, and refused to be ordinary. That's courage. And it's why people still whisper his name today. When you strip away the legend, the dust and the stories, you find something simple at the core of Doc's life. He lived honestly. He faced truth. He loved his friends, and he never let fear make him small. Maybe that's why people still tell his story. Because deep down, we all want to live like that, without fear, without regret, without pretending. Doc's story reminds us that you don't need to be perfect to be powerful. You just need to be brave enough to live honestly, even when life hurts. Today, his name still rides on the wind. It echoes in old Western songs, in the movies, in the hearts of those who admire courage. And every time someone says, "I'm your Huckleberry," they're really saying, "I'll stand by you. I'll face the storm with you." That's what Doc stood for. Not death, but loyalty. Not violence, but honor. Not fear, but freedom. He was a man who turned his pain into purpose, his sickness into strength, and his short life into legend. So when you think of Doc Holliday, don't just picture the gunslinger at the OK Corral. Picture the man, thin, coughing, smiling, who kept living, loving, and laughing even when his days were numbered. That's the true story. That's the real legacy, because legends may fade, but courage, real human courage, never dies. And that's why, more than a century later, Doc Holliday is still alive, not in body, but in spirit. Every time someone faces fear with a steady heart, or stands up for a friend, or laughs in the face of hardship, that's him. Still here, still reminding the world that death only wins when we stop living.